Hey everyone, tonight we're going back. We have got you waking up inside a 1940s kitchen on a sick day, where the medicine cabinet is almost entirely homemade and your mother already knows exactly what to do. We have got the extraordinary story of Vicks VapoRub, a product so deeply embedded in American family memory that its smell alone can transport grown adults back to a childhood bedroom with a wool blanket tucked around their chin. We have got you working the pharmacy counter at a mid-century drugstore in a small American town, measuring out cod liver oil and answering questions that technically should have been directed to a doctor. And we have got the hidden reality of home medicine in America, the gap between the confident, capable, slightly alarming world of the folk remedy and the medical establishment that spent decades trying to figure out what to do about it. So before you get settled, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy spending time here. And leave me a comment letting me know where you are watching from and what time it is wherever you are. I love seeing that. Now get comfortable, maybe pull a blanket up and let us go back together. The first thing you register is the smell. Before the light, before the sounds of the house beginning its morning argument with itself, before the particular quality of cold air that tells you something is not quite right with the world today, there is the smell. Camphor and eucalyptus and something underneath both of them that you will never be able to name precisely, only recognize, only understand in your chest and the back of your throat as the smell of being taken care of. You are 7 years old. You woke up this morning with a cough that your mother heard from the hallway, which means she heard it from across the room, which means she was already awake, already listening, already running the mental calculation that mothers in 1943 run when they hear a child cough at 4 a.m. You're not going to school today. You knew this before she said it. You knew it from the way she pressed the back of her hand to your forehead, palm side up, which is the way that actually tells you something, not the theatrical palm-on-forehead gesture that is more comfort than diagnosis. Her hand was cool and dry and it stayed there for exactly as long as it needed to stay there. And then she made a sound that was not quite a word but contained all the information of one. You have a slight fever, not bad. Not the kind that means she calls someone, not the kind that means anything drastic. The kind that means she already knows what she's doing. She does not consult a book. She does not consult a neighbour. She does not pick up the telephone and navigate the considerable social complexity of calling the doctor's office, which requires justification and a certain willingness to have your concern evaluated and possibly found insufficient. She goes to the kitchen. That is where it starts. In 1943, the kitchen is the first pharmacy, and your mother is its most knowledgeable practitioner, and she trained under her own mother, who trained under hers, and the lineage of this knowledge goes back through kitchens that smelled different, but operated on the same essential principle. The body has its ways of going wrong. The household has its ways of bringing it back. Everything in between is patience and the right application of the right remedy at the right time. You hear her moving downstairs while you lie in the bed that is now yours entirely for the whole day, a luxury so unusual it almost compensates for feeling terrible. The sound of a pot being placed on the gas stove, a small sound with a particular metallic quality. The sound of the icebox being opened, the slight resistance and release of the rubber seal. The sound of something being measured into something else, a liquid against glass, careful and deliberate. She's not rushing. She never rushes with this. It is one of the things about being sick in your mother's house in 1943 that you will not fully appreciate until you are much older, and you're sick somewhere else entirely, somewhere that does not have her in it, and you will remember the sound of that unhurried measuring with a longing that surprises you with its intensity. The first thing she brings up is the hot lemon and honey. Not tea, or not primarily tea, though there is tea in it. A weak pale tea that serves mainly as the warm vehicle for everything else. The honey is from a jar on the back of the pantry shelf. A dark amber honey that came from a neighbour 2 towns over and arrived in a mason jar with no label, which gives it a gravity and specificity that the store-bought version lacks. The lemon is from a string bag by the window. 3 lemons left. She will need to put lemon on the shopping list. She squeezes half of one into the mug and cuts a thin round from the other half to float on the surface, because presentation matters even when you are 7 and sick, especially when you're 7 and sick, because the ritual of the thing is part of the medicine. You have heard this your entire life, though you have heard it in the language of action rather than words. When your grandmother visited last summer and caught a cold, she did not say, The immune-stimulating properties of ascorbic acid combined with the antimicrobial and soothing qualities of raw honey form a reasonable first-line intervention. She said, "I need hot lemon and honey," and said it with the confidence of someone who has verified this approximately 40 times. The science, such as it was in 1943, was not something your mother thought about. What she thought about was that this worked. Specifically, that it had worked. That her mother had given it to her, and her mother had recovered, and she had given it to her children, and her children had recovered, and the causality was obvious if you did not think about it too carefully, and there was very little reason in a 1943 kitchen to think about it too carefully. You sip the lemon honey tea slowly. It is too hot at first. You blow across the surface of it the way she showed you, the mug held in both hands because the warmth against your palms is part of the medicine too, or at least feels like it is, which amounts to the same thing when you are 7. The honey leaves a coating in your throat that is not exactly comforting and is not exactly not comforting. It is thick and sweet and faintly floral, and the lemon cuts through it just enough, and the heat of the liquid does something to the tight feeling in your chest that is not cure exactly, but is recognition. The body acknowledging that something is being done for it. Your mother comes back with a second thing. A small dark bottle with a label you cannot quite read from where you're sitting, though you know what it says because you have seen it your whole life. Castor oil. She has already measured out a spoonful, which is approximately 1 spoonful more castor oil than you would choose to take voluntarily under any circumstances whatsoever. Castor oil is the remedy that does not pretend to be pleasant. It makes no apologies. It arrives with the energy of a treatment that is confident in its own effectiveness and indifferent to the experience of the person receiving it. Your mother holds out the spoon. You look at the spoon. There is a negotiation, conducted entirely without words, that you lose. Castor oil has been in American medicine cabinets, or their predecessors, for a very long time. It is pressed from the seeds of the Ricinus communis plant, a plant that is also the source of ricin, which is one of the most toxic substances known to exist, though the oil extracted from it through the pressing process contains none of that toxicity, a fact that does not make swallowing a spoonful of it any more appealing, but is at least somewhat reassuring in principle. Your mother's mother's mother used castor oil. In the 1940s, it is still being used for everything from constipation to skin conditions to general sluggishness, administered with a confidence that does not entirely match the medical evidence, but is not entirely without foundation either. It is genuinely a laxative. What it is doing for your cough and slight fever is a more interesting question, and one that your mother is not asking. After the castor oil, there is a period of waiting, which passes in that specific way that sick days pass, time moving at a different speed than usual, slower in some ways and faster in others. You sleep for a while, or something that is close to sleeping, warm and slightly disconnected from the edges of your body, the blanket heavy, the pillow flattened to exactly the shape of your head. You can hear the house around you, your mother in the kitchen below, the particular rhythm of her movements that you have memorized without meaning to, the way someone memorizes the sounds of a place they feel safe in. When you wake again, the light through the window has changed, moved toward afternoon, and your mother is in the doorway with something that smells different from everything else she has brought you. This smell is the smell. This is the camphor and eucalyptus you registered when you first woke up, except now it is close. It is coming from a small blue jar she holds in one hand and a cloth she holds in the other, and you know exactly what is about to happen, because this has happened before, when you had that bad cough in the winter of 1941, when your brother had the chest cold that lasted a full 2 weeks. Vicks VapoRub arrives with the gravity of a serious intervention. Your mother opens the jar and the smell fills the room immediately, that particular sharp, clean medicinal quality that belongs entirely to itself, that cannot be approximated or substituted. She warms a small amount between her fingers, not heating it, just taking the chill of the kitchen off it, and then she begins to apply it to your chest, small circles, deliberate pressure, not massage exactly, but not simply spreading it either. Something purposeful in the motion, something that communicates, in the language of hands on a sick child's chest, that this is being taken seriously, and that things are being done, and that the doing of things is itself a form of care. The Vicks goes on your chest, and then, in the custom your mother inherited from her mother, which may or may not have originated with any official instruction, a square of old flannel is laid over it, warm from having been sitting near the stove. The flannel traps the vapours against your skin, traps the warmth, creates a small concentrated environment of eucalyptus and camphor against your sternum. And then she covers you back up with the blanket. And then she tells you to breathe through your nose. And you do, and the smell of it, the warmth of it, the particular dense quality of breathing in that specific air, does something that is very hard to describe clinically, but very easy to describe experientially. You breathe in again. The tight feeling in your chest does not vanish, but it recedes to a distance where it feels manageable. This is the camphor doing what camphor does, acting as a counter-irritant, creating a cool sensation that overrides the discomfort beneath it. But what you feel at 7 is simply that you can breathe better. That something is better, that your mother knew what to do. By afternoon, she will bring you broth. Not soup, not yet, broth specifically. The liquid that she cooked out of a chicken carcass that has been in the icebox since Sunday's dinner. She skimmed the fat off this morning, which is why the surface of the bowl when she brings it up is clear and amber rather than cloudy. She has added salt and something green, a little parsley, and the smell of it is the smell of warm and restoration, and nothing being asked of you. Chicken broth in the 1940s is not a sentimental choice or a nostalgic one. It is the most efficient available delivery mechanism for warm salt water into a body that needs both warmth and salt, and the comfort of liquid that is not quite food and not quite drink, but occupies a place that is more nourishing than either. Medical researchers in the 1940s did not yet know, in the way that can be published and cited, what your mother already knew in the way that can be demonstrated. They were not yet running clinical trials on chicken soup. That would come later, and the findings would confirm what she already understood in her bones. The warm liquid, the steam rising from it while you hold the bowl, the way you sip it slowly, and each sip is something your body wanted, and each sip makes the wanting a little less urgent. The salt, the heat, the bare and sufficient nutrition of it. By the time the light begins to go, you are genuinely sleepy. The deep, ordinary sleepy of a body doing repair work, not the hot, restless, almost sleep of the fever. Your mother takes your temperature again, the glass thermometer under your tongue for what feels like forever, because when you are 7, you have not yet learned the particular patience that thermometers require. She reads it in the last of the afternoon light from the window, holding it at the angle that makes the mercury visible. The fever has come down, not gone, but down. Enough that the expression on her face changes from the careful neutral she has maintained all day. The face that does not alarm you, but also does not reassure you falsely, to something easier. She shakes the thermometer down with a practiced flick of the wrist and sets it back in its little glass case on the windowsill. Tonight she will bring you a mustard plaster, or she'll heat a cloth and lay it on your chest if the mustard plaster seems like too much, because there are degrees of intervention, and she reads them the way a diagnostician reads symptoms, from the accumulation of small signs rather than from any single piece of evidence. A mustard plaster is flour and dry mustard mixed together with just enough water to make a paste, spread between 2 pieces of cloth, applied to the chest with care because the mustard can irritate the skin if left too long, and the point is stimulation, not damage. The heat it produces is not the heat of the cloth but a chemical heat, a warmth that comes from inside the skin itself, or feels like it does. And the sensation of it is one of those treatments that is so specific to its era that even the people who grew up with it can barely explain it later. You just remember the warmth, and that breathing was easier afterward. Tomorrow, if you are better, she will let you come downstairs. She'll make you cocoa, not as medicine but as acknowledgement, a small celebration of returning to the world of the vertical. If you're not better, she will repeat the day, not with anxiety, not with escalation, but with the same steady rhythm of the day before. Lemon and honey in the morning, broth in the afternoon, Vicks and flannel and the mustard plaster, patience and warmth, and the specific intelligence of a woman who has learned the difference between what can be managed and what cannot, and who has spent her entire adult life managing the one and watching carefully for signs of the other. What she's watching for, though she would not use these words, is the thing that changes the calculation. A fever that goes higher instead of lower, a cough that moves deeper into the chest, that takes on a different quality, wetter, and more alarming. A colour in the skin that is not just the flush of fever but something else, something that makes the back of her hand on your forehead insufficient and makes her reach for her coat and reach for the telephone and navigate the social complexity of the doctor after all. She has 2 children and she has lived through the 1931 influenza outbreak, and she knows the difference. She has always known the difference. The home remedies are not denial. They are the first layer of a system that has more layers than anyone gives it credit for, and she is entirely capable of moving through all the layers when she needs to. But today you do not need the doctor. Today you need the lemon and honey, and the Vicks, and the broth, and the mustard plaster at bedtime, and the sound of your mother's unhurried movements in the kitchen below you. You need the smell of camphor and eucalyptus in the room when you fall asleep, the specific comfort of a body being attended to in the specific language of someone who loves you and knows exactly what to do. The fever will break tonight. You will sleep hard and long and wake up tomorrow lighter. The particular lightness of a body that has finished the work of being sick and is ready to return to the ordinary work of being well. And the jar of Vicks will go back on the shelf beside the castor oil and the dark amber honey, waiting for the next time, patient as everything in that kitchen, ready as everything in your mother's hands. That shelf is worth looking at for a moment. The medicine shelf in a 1940s household kitchen or bathroom, depending on the house, is not the dramatic abundance of the modern medicine cabinet, not the parade of brand-name pharmaceuticals and supplements and tablets in their orange prescription bottles. It is specific, contained, chosen over time. A brown glass bottle of hydrogen peroxide, 3%, used for wounds and occasionally for gargling when a sore throat arrives. A tin of boric acid, used for eye washes, a practice that will fall out of favour as the century progresses, but which is in 1943 standard enough to be unremarkable. A bottle of iodine in its distinctive deep amber glass, the kind of iodine that stains everything. It touches a deep burnt orange and leaves a mark on skin that lasts for days, and was interpreted by many mothers as evidence that the wound was being treated even after the treatment was no longer needed. Beside the iodine, in many households, a bottle of camphorated oil, which is different from the Vicks though, related to it in the camphor that they share, used for rubbing into sore muscles and aching joints and occasionally for ear troubles. A small tin of zinc oxide ointment, a roll of adhesive tape and a small pair of scissors kept together so neither is ever useful without the other. Aspirin, of course. Aspirin in a tin because the childproof cap has not yet been invented and will not be for decades. Aspirin in a dose that will later seem excessive, and that was used in the 1940s for everything from headaches to fevers to arthritis, to the vague diagnosis of not feeling well, which in the 1940s covers a substantial amount of medical ground. And then the things that are not in bottles or tins, the dark amber honey in its mason jar, the lemons in the string bag by the window, the dry mustard in its tin in the back of the spice cabinet, used primarily for cooking but available, always available, for the mustard plaster when the chest cold arrives, the flour that is there for bread and pie crusts, but which knows its role in the emergency room that the kitchen doubles as, the salt, always the salt, for gargling and for broth and for wound cleaning, and for the warm saline that is the simplest and most reliable treatment for more conditions than most people in 1943 could list. Not because they had not noticed this, but because they had noticed it so thoroughly that it no longer required remarking on. This is the kitchen as medicine cabinet, and it is specific to an era and an economic reality and a relationship between women and medical knowledge that will shift, gradually and then rapidly, over the next 3 decades. In 1943, the family doctor is a figure of genuine authority, but limited availability, limited time, and limited tools. The pharmacist is a knowledgeable professional, but also a neighbour, someone you know by name, someone who will sometimes tell you things that technically should come from the doctor, but who understands that you are asking the question in the pharmacy, because getting to the doctor requires an appointment and a reason that feels sufficient and money that is not always there. And in between the doctor and the pharmacist there is your mother and the kitchen shelf and the accumulated knowledge of generations of women who learned what to do because there was often no one else to do it. The remedies were not all correct. Some of them were neutral, doing nothing in particular but doing it warmly and with attention. Some of them were actively effective, the lemon and honey doing what it was believed to do, more or less, the warmth and steam doing what warmth and steam genuinely do. The chicken broth delivering what a body needs and asking nothing complicated of it. And some of them were wrong in ways that the era could not yet fully measure. Wrong in dosage or in mechanism or in the assumptions underlying the treatment. Wrong in the specific way that something can be wrong when it is based on observation and pattern matching rather than controlled experiment. But the observation was real. The pattern matching was real. The care embedded in every one of them was real, and in some ways that was the most effective ingredient. The thing that could not be measured and was not measured and would never quite make it into a clinical trial, but that any 7-year-old lying in a warm bed with flannel on their chest and camphor in the air could have told you, without hesitation, was working. There is a particular kind of intelligence required to manage a household's health in 1943, and it is not the intelligence that gets written down in books or validated in institutions. It is the intelligence of pattern, accumulated over years of watching and doing and trying again. Your mother did not become fluent in the body's ordinary distress events all at once. She learned it the way all the most essential knowledge gets learned, incrementally through cases, through the year your brother had the ear infection, and through the summer your grandmother visited with something that the doctor, when he finally came, called gastroenteritis, and through the small, repetitive catalogue of the things that children do with their bodies in the years between infancy and adolescence. By the time you are 7 and coughing, she has a taxonomy of coughs. She knew from the moment she heard you, before she was fully out of bed herself, which category this one fell into. The taxonomy of coughs in the household medicine of the 1940s is more sophisticated than it is given credit for. There is the cough that is dry and frequent and originates high in the throat, which is the cough of irritation, of dry air, of the beginning of something or the end of something. There is the cough that is wet and loose, that comes from lower in the chest, that sounds like it is bringing something up that the body wants out, which is a productive cough, and is viewed differently from the dry one, viewed with more seriousness and also with more hope because the body visibly working is at least the body working. There is the croup cough, the barking seal sound that you hear once and never forget, that sends a specific alarm through any parent who's heard it before, because it means the upper airway is narrowing and the child needs steam and needs it now, not tomorrow now. And the bathroom door gets closed and the hot water runs in the sink and you sit on the floor in the steam with the child in your lap and you breathe together until the barking softens into ordinary coughing and then into something more manageable. The steam treatment for croup is one of the remedies that survived the transition from folk medicine to clinical practice without significant modification, which is notable because that transition weeded out a great many other treatments. The mechanism is real. The steam moistens and soothes the inflamed tissue of the upper airway. The warm, moist air reduces the viscosity of the secretions that contribute to the narrowing. And the sitting in a small enclosed warm space with a frightened child has its own calming effect on both the child and the parent that is not incidental and is not outside the therapeutic process. The child calms. The muscles around the airway relax slightly. The cough softens. These things happen in sequence and they all matter. The steam is not doing all of it alone. But your cough this morning is not croup. Your cough is the manageable one, the one your mother has seen before, the one she has a protocol for. And the protocol begins before you are fully aware of being sick, begins in the night when she hears you from down the hall and she lies in bed for a moment assessing it, the way a navigator reads the sky, reading the sound of you against her accumulated knowledge of the sound of you when everything is fine and the sound of you when something is beginning. Then she gets up. She does not turn on the overhead light. She moves in the dark the way she always moves in the dark, which is quietly and with certainty, because she has been moving through this house in the dark for a long time and knows exactly where everything is and how much noise each floorboard makes. She puts her hand on your forehead in the dark. You feel it before you are fully awake. The cool, dry palm of her hand, the flat of it resting against your skin, reading you the way you read a surface with your eyes. She's not checking your temperature with the precision of a thermometer. She's checking it with the precision of her hand, which has been reading foreheads for a decade and has its own calibration. The hand tells her, fever, yes, moderate, not high, not the kind that requires the thermometer immediately and the light on and the serious voice, the kind that requires lemon and honey in the morning and rest today and watching. She goes back to bed. She will have heard you well enough, assessed the situation well enough, and decided that the response is monitoring, not intervention, not yet. She lies in the dark with the particular awareness of someone who has put herself back to sleep with a task still active, the way you leave a pot simmering on a low flame before you go out, knowing something is happening but that it is contained and does not require your continuous presence, only your periodic attention. She will be up before you are properly awake. She will have been downstairs in the kitchen before the house has fully committed to the day. The kitchen in the early morning of a 1943 household is a specific kind of quiet. The stove has not been lit yet. The icebox hums. The window over the sink is pale with early light. A particular milky grey of a morning that has not decided yet whether it is going to be sunny or overcast. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. That reserves its options for a little while longer while the world below it makes its plans. She opens the icebox for the lemon. She opens the back of the pantry for the honey. The jar of honey in the pantry is not from a store. It is from the neighbour 2 doors down who keeps bees in the backyard garden and who brings over a jar twice a year, in late spring and again in fall, and accepts in exchange whatever your mother has in surplus, pickled beets one time, and the bread that she makes on Fridays that is better than anyone else's bread in this immediate neighbourhood. Though no one says this directly because saying it would require acknowledging that you have compared. The neighbour's honey is dark, almost mahogany in colour, which indicates that the bees are working late summer wildflowers rather than the lighter spring blossoms, and the flavour is robust enough that even a small amount is present in whatever it is added to. Your mother uses it sparingly in cooking and generously in medicine, an allocation that tells you something about how she has organised the hierarchy of the household's needs. The lemon is from a net bag by the window. She cuts it in half with a single smooth motion, the knife moving with the efficiency of someone who has done this particular cut thousands of times, and she squeezes it into the mug, catching the seeds with her other hand without being asked to, without thinking about it, a practiced move. The mug is ceramic, heavyweight, one of a set of 4 that came with the house when they moved in, and that has since become 3.5, one having lost its handle in an incident that is now family mythology, still with its handle referenced ironically when someone needs to fetch it from the back of the cabinet. She fills it with hot water from the kettle, which was already on because she put it on first before she did anything else, because this is the first order of operations in any morning that begins with someone sick. The kettle goes on. The hot water is the prerequisite for everything else. She stirs in a spoonful of honey, watching it dissolve, which it does slowly, the dark sweetness spreading through the pale liquid in ribbons that gradually become invisible as the honey distributes itself through the hole. Then she carries it up. The stairs in this house make a sound on the 4th step, a sound so reliable it has become a form of signal, a way of knowing from anywhere in the house that someone is coming up, and you hear it now, before she reaches your door, and you know it is her and you know what she is carrying, and you feel, even through the fog of the slight fever and the dry throat and the general unhappiness of being unwell, something that is very close to relief. Not because the lemon and honey is going to cure you in any immediate way, because she is coming, because the sound of the 4th stair means the day has been reorganised around your being sick, that the household has registered the situation and has responded to it, that you are not alone with it. She sets the mug on the nightstand on a cloth she brought with her specifically for this purpose, because she does not want moisture rings on the wood, and she sits on the edge of the bed, and she tells you to drink it slowly, and she watches you take the first sip, and she checks the expression on your face. Not for pain, but for how you are generally, for the particular information that a face gives when it is not performing, when it is just reacting to things. She's been reading your face since the day you were born. She knows your face better than you know it yourself, knows the difference between the look of headache and the look of stomachache, knows the particular way your eyes go when you are tired versus when you are genuinely ill, knows the subtle signal that means something is getting worse versus something that is holding where it is. While you sip the tea, she tidies the room, not in a way that makes it feel like tidying, just straightening things that have gotten displaced in the night, pulling the curtain so the light is better but not direct, checking that the chamber pot is accessible in case you need it without getting up to the bathroom down the hall. These are small acts and they accumulate into something larger, into an environment that has been considered and adjusted for your specific current state, into a room that feels different from the way it feels on an ordinary morning. Softer somehow, more deliberate. A room that has been made into a sick room without any of the drama that the phrase sick room implies, just through the quiet attention of someone who knows how to make spaces feel right for what they are needed for. The castor oil comes next. She has not mentioned it, and she's not going to build up to it or negotiate around it. She produces it from the pocket of her housecoat, which is where she put it when she came upstairs because she knew you would not go looking for it, and that leaving it visible on the nightstand from the beginning of the tea would compromise the quality of the tea drinking experience. The spoon has already been measured. She holds both items out. You look at the spoon with the expression of someone who has calculated the available options and found all of them suboptimal. She waits. Her face does not change. This is the face of someone who has already waited out this specific negotiation multiple times and knows exactly how it ends. The castor oil is not the worst thing. It is, however, the most clearly the worst thing, in the sense that it makes no effort to be anything other than what it is, which is a viscous, pale, faintly unpleasant oil that you're expected to swallow from a spoon, and that will, in the hour or so afterward, do what castor oil does, thoroughly and without ambiguity. Your mother follows it with a piece of bread that she was holding in her other hand, the bread appearing immediately after the spoon is withdrawn, the sequence so practiced that it feels choreographed. The bread helps, not with the taste exactly, but with the physical fact of it, the density of the bread interrupting the sensation of the oil in a way that moves the experience toward completion. You chew, you swallow, it is over. There is a long history to the belief in castor oil as a general medicinal intervention, a history that goes back to ancient Egypt, and that runs forward through folk medicine and patent medicine, and the household remedy culture of the early and mid-20th century. The ancient Egyptians called it kiki, and used it as a laxative and as an externally applied treatment for skin conditions. The Romans used it similarly. By the time it arrives in the American household of the 1940s, it has been a domestic remedy for so long that its origins feel less like history and more like nature, less like something that was decided at some point, and more like something that simply is. Your mother uses it because her mother used it because her mother used it. And in the transmission of that practice, each generation observed that the children who received it recovered from their colds and attributed the recovery to the oil, which is the attribution error that is almost impossible to avoid when your sample size is your own children and your control group is non-existent. What is interesting about the castor oil tradition in the context of cold and fever treatment is what it reveals about the underlying model of disease that shaped the home remedy system of that era. The model was one of accumulation and purging, the idea that illness entered the body and needed to be expelled, that the body could be assisted in this expulsion by various forms of clearing the bowels, clearing the airways, clearing the skin through sweating. This is not the germ theory of disease, which had been established by the late 19th century and was the intellectual foundation of professional medicine by 1943. It is an older model, one that predates germ theory, and persisted alongside it in the folk tradition, not because people were unaware that bacteria and viruses existed, but because the explanatory framework of purging and clearing was intuitive in a way that the molecular mechanism of viral replication was not, and intuitive frameworks are remarkably durable. The sweating tradition, in particular, persisted alongside the castor oil and the other remedies. Your mother, and your grandmother before her, believed in the value of sweating a fever out, a belief that is medically complicated in ways that 1943 was not equipped to fully articulate. The fever itself is the body's immune response, a raising of the internal temperature to create an environment less hospitable to the pathogen. Sweating is how the body eventually loses that heat. So in a mechanistic sense, the sweating is the sign of the fever breaking rather than the means by which it breaks. But the relationship between the two is close enough that the observational evidence for the sweating tradition was genuinely present, genuinely visible. The child was covered with blankets. The child sweated. The fever came down. The conclusion that the blankets caused the sweating and the sweating caused the recovery is not unreasonable given what was available to observe. Your mother puts extra blankets on you after the castor oil and before the Vicks, in the specific sequence she has developed over years of this practice, a sequence that feels to her like the right order, and that is in fact no more or less effective in a different order, but that she has come to believe matters in the way that rituals come to feel like they matter, as if the order itself is part of the mechanism, as if doing things out of sequence would disrupt something essential. The blankets are heavy. You can feel the weight of them, the specific pressure of 2 extra blankets settling on your legs and torso, a pressure that is not uncomfortable, but is present in a way that feels like intention, as if the blankets themselves have decided to take part in the process. The morning stretches. You drift in and out of something that is between sleep and waking, the fever creating a slightly loosened relationship between your thoughts and the usual strict sequence of things. The sounds of the house come and go, your mother moving through the rooms below, the occasional sound of something being placed on the stove, the faint voice of the radio that she turns on at 9 o'clock, always at 9 o'clock, for the morning programs that she listens to while she works. The radio voice is a specific kind of company, present without being demanding, filling the air with human sound without requiring anything from her in return, which is exactly the kind of company that a woman doing the work of a household by herself on a Tuesday morning can actually use. You're aware of the smell of lunch before you're aware of being hungry. The broth has been on for hours, the chicken carcass from Sunday simmering in the big pot, and the smell of it has been rising through the house in layers, the first layer being the smell of hot water and raw chicken, which is not entirely pleasant, and then later the deeper smell of the stock itself developing, the gelatin from the bones leaching out and making the liquid richer, the parsley and the onion and the celery adding their notes, the salt coming in last to tie everything together. By the time she brings a bowl upstairs, you're sitting up in bed without being asked to, drawn vertical by the smell, your body registering it as something it needs before your conscious mind has finished the sentence. The bowl is set on the cloth on the nightstand and you hold it in both hands because she hands it to you that way, placing both your hands around it, the warmth of the bowl transmitting through your palms in a way that feels direct and immediate and important. The broth is clear, completely clear, no fat floating on the surface because she skimmed it twice during the cooking. The colour is a deep golden amber, the particular colour of good stock that has cooked long enough to extract everything the bones have to give. You sip it from the bowl rather than using the spoon, which she allows on sick days specifically, this being one of the few modifications to ordinary table practice that illness earns you. The right to hold the bowl in both hands and drink from it directly, like something from another century, like something honest about what the body actually needs and how it wants to receive it. Take a moment with that, because what comes next belongs to the same world, even if it approaches it from a different direction. We have been inside the kitchen, inside the experience of receiving care. Now let us follow one of the objects on that kitchen shelf, out of the pantry and back into the factory and the family and the extraordinary accident of history that turned a regional pharmacist's formula into one of the most recognizable smells in the American domestic world. There is a particular kind of American business story that begins in a small town with a man who was paying attention. Lunsford Richardson was paying attention in Selma, North Carolina, in the 1880s, where he worked as a pharmacist and watched the people who came into his drugstore, watched what they bought and what they could not afford and what they needed that nobody was selling them yet. He was not a romantic figure in the conventional sense. He was methodical, he was observant, and he had a brother-in-law, a doctor named Joshua Vick, whose name would end up on the label of something that would outlast them both by more than a century. Richardson had been experimenting with petroleum jelly as a base for medicinal compounds, which was not an original idea in the 1890s when petroleum jelly was new enough to be interesting, and pharmacists were still largely in the business of compounding their own preparations. What he was working toward was a salve that could be rubbed onto the chest and throat, something that could deliver the volatile oils of eucalyptus and camphor and menthol through the skin and through the air simultaneously, a dual delivery system, topical and inhalation at once. The technology was simple, the petroleum jelly base holding the volatile ingredients in suspension until body heat released them. The concept, though, was genuinely clever. He called it Vicks Magic Croup and Pneumonia Cure initially, which gives you a sense of the regulatory environment of the 1890s, when you could call something a cure in the name of the product, and this was not considered problematic. The name later became Vicks VapoRub, which is a better name in every way, describing what the product does rather than what the product promises, a shift in marketing philosophy that was itself a small piece of evidence about how the relationship between manufacturers and consumers was beginning to change. By the early 1900s, Richardson was manufacturing and selling his product out of a small operation in Greensboro, North Carolina, where he had moved his family and his business. The early business was modest, regional. The product moved through drugstores in the South and the Mid-Atlantic states, carried by salesmen who travelled by rail and wagon, who knew how to talk to pharmacists and how to leave behind enough samples to generate the word of mouth that was, in the early 1900s, the most reliable form of advertising there was. Richardson understood something important about his market. His product was not going to be sold by arguments or by technical specifications. It was going to be sold by mothers telling other mothers, by the experience of the remedy working, or at least feeling like it worked, which in the realm of comfort care is not always a meaningful distinction. Then came 1918. The influenza pandemic of 1918 is one of the most catastrophic events in American history, and one of the most under-remembered, a mortality event of such scale that it defies ordinary comprehension. Somewhere between 50 million and 100 million people died globally. In the United States, the death toll was somewhere between 500,000 and 675,000, a number that represents a significant fraction of the entire country at the time, and medicine, in 1918, had essentially nothing to offer. There were no antivirals, there were no antibiotics for the secondary bacterial pneumonias that killed so many of the victims. There were supportive measures, and there was prayer, and there was exactly the kind of home remedy that mothers had been giving their children for decades: the steam inhalation, the camphor and eucalyptus rub, the warmth and the chicken broth and the patient attendance at a bedside. Vicks VapoRub sold 12 million jars during the influenza pandemic of 1918 and 1919. 12 million. In a country of approximately 100 million people. The sales number tells you something about the terror of the time and the desperate need for something, anything, that could be placed in a family's hands and used immediately, that did not require a doctor visit that might be impossible to arrange and might not result in anything more effective anyway. The VapoRub was not a cure for influenza, was not remotely a cure for influenza, but in a world without any cures at all, it offered warmth and vapour and the camphor that opened airways and the sensation of doing something in the face of an enemy that did not respond to anything else people tried. That was not nothing. In 1918 and 19, that was very nearly everything available. The company that Richardson built was purchased by Procter & Gamble in 1985, a transaction that ended decades of family ownership, but did not change the product in any meaningful way. Vicks VapoRub in 2023 is chemically almost identical to Vicks VapoRub in 1943. The camphor is still there, the eucalyptus oil is still there, the menthol is still there, the petroleum jelly base is still there, the smell is exactly the same smell. It is one of the rare continuities in a consumer culture that reinvents itself continuously, a product so thoroughly identified with a specific sensory experience and a specific emotional memory that changing it would be commercially catastrophic, and there has never been any serious reason to try. What Richardson built, without intending to, was less a product than an olfactory memory. The smell of VapoRub is not associated with illness. It is associated with being cared for during illness, which is entirely different and considerably more powerful as an association. People who grew up in the middle decades of the 20th century in American households, where VapoRub was used, carry that smell not in the nose but in the chest, in something closer to the emotional centre of the body, where it sits alongside the smell of their mother's kitchen and the particular quality of light through a bedroom window on a school morning when you were too sick to go and the day opened up ahead of you, unstructured and unexpectedly free, full of soup and cartoons and the warm cocoon of being attended to. The science behind VapoRub has been studied more carefully in recent decades than it was in the 1940s, and the findings are interesting. The camphor and menthol do not, technically speaking, open the airways. They create a sensation of openness, a cooling effect in the nasal passages and throat that triggers the perception of improved airflow without actually changing the physical dimensions of anything. A person breathing through congested airways after applying VapoRub to their chest is still breathing through congested airways, but they feel less congested, and that feeling of less congestion is real, and the distinction between feeling less congested and being less congested matters a great deal in a clinical trial and matters very little to a 7-year-old who can breathe better now. The eucalyptus oil has genuine antimicrobial properties. The menthol has genuine cough-suppressing effects at higher doses. The act of applying the product, the warmth of hands on chest, the covering with flannel, the sending of a sick child back to bed with something done, is itself therapeutic in ways that are more difficult to quantify, but no less real. Richardson, who was simply a pharmacist trying to help the people who came into his store, built something that was effective across multiple registers simultaneously, and it took the rest of medicine the better part of a century to fully articulate why. He died in 1919, just as the influenza pandemic was ending, just as the 12 million jars had been sold and the business had been transformed. He did not live to see the post-war boom that made VapoRub a fixture in virtually every American medicine cabinet, did not live to see his products achieve the kind of cultural penetration where it appears in novels and memoirs as a shorthand for a particular kind of American domestic care. His son Smithfield took over and ran the business for decades, and under his leadership the company became Richardson Vicks, and then eventually part of something much larger. But the product remained, remarkably unchanged, the smell remaining, the blue jar remaining, the ritual of the application remaining. The blue jar itself is worth a moment. It is a specific shade of blue, not quite teal, not quite the mid-century turquoise that appeared on refrigerators and automobiles and kitchen appliances in the 1950s, but something slightly older, slightly more medicinal in its colour, the blue of a bottle that contains something serious. It is a wide-mouthed jar, which is a functional design choice, wide enough to get your fingers into without a spoon or a tool, designed for direct application by hand. The lid screws on and off. The sound of the lid being unscrewed is part of the experience, a small release of the smell before the jar is even open, because the threads of the lid collect the product and the volatile oils escape the moment any air can get in. Your grandmother had a jar of it. Your mother had a jar of it. You have probably, if you grew up in a certain era of American domestic life, encountered a jar of it in someone's bathroom cabinet or kitchen shelf, and when you opened it, or when someone opened it near you, the smell went directly to a place in your memory that is not quite accessible by other means. This is the strange power of the olfactory system, its direct connection to the limbic structures of the brain, its refusal to be processed through the ordinary channels of rational thought. The smell of camphor and eucalyptus and menthol does not remind you of Lunsford Richardson or Procter & Gamble, or the influenza pandemic of 1918. It reminds you of being 7, of the flannel on your chest, of a hand on your forehead. That is the product's actual legacy, and it is one that no marketing campaign designed it for and no clinical trial can measure. Richardson's story is not unusual in the history of American patent medicine and pharmaceutical development. It is, in fact, a template. A pharmacist with a formula, a region, a disaster that creates the conditions for national expansion, a family that maintains the business across generations, and eventually a sale to a corporation large enough to manufacture and distribute globally. What makes it unusual is only the product itself, that it survived as a product, that it did not change, that the thing Lunsford Richardson mixed in his pharmacy in Selma, North Carolina in the 1890s is recognizably the same thing that sits on pharmacy shelves and in bathroom cabinets today. Most patent medicines of that era are gone. Some deserve to go. VapoRub persisted because it did something real, or at least something that felt real enough, consistently enough, across enough chests and enough winters and enough sick children and enough mothers with their unhurried hands, that the case for it renewing itself in every generation proved impossible to argue with. There is a postscript worth noting. Studies published in the early 2000s raised concerns about VapoRub use in children under 2, finding that the product could increase mucus production in young infants and potentially worsen congestion in very small airways. The warnings on the packaging were updated. The recommendation became that VapoRub should not be used on infants under 3 months of age and should be used with caution in very young children. These findings would have surprised exactly no one in the 1940s, because in the 1940s no one was applying it to infants under 2. The remedy was understood as appropriate for children old enough to be sick, in the way children were sick, with the chest colds and the croup and the winter coughs that came with the school year, not for the smallest ones, who had their own entirely different set of emergencies and their own set of treatments. The context in which the remedy lived was specific, and it knew its own edges, even if those edges were never written down anywhere. What Lunsford Richardson built finally is a small corner of the American domestic ritual, a very specific and very persistent set of actions that have been performed in the same sequence by millions of people for more than 100 years. Open the jar, warm a small amount between the fingers, apply to the chest, cover with flannel, cover the patient with the blanket, say breathe through your nose, leave the room or stay in the room depending on what is needed, but know that the thing in the air will work on its own now. The camphor doing its chemical work, the warmth doing its physical work, the smell doing its emotional work, and none of these three things is incidental, and all of them together are, as near as a pharmacist in 1890-something could get, medicine. To understand what Richardson built, it helps to understand what the patent medicine landscape looked like in the years when he was beginning, and what it had already become by the time he entered it. The 1880s and 90s in America were the peak years of a particular kind of commercial medicine, a period when the regulatory environment was almost entirely absent, and the claims that could be made on a bottle were limited only by the imagination of the person writing the label. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. This was the era of Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound, which promised relief for all female complaints, a category broad enough to encompass essentially anything that could be experienced by a woman at any point in her life. The compound contained approximately 18% alcohol by volume, which likely explained a significant portion of its reported effectiveness. It was the era of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, which was marketed for the teething troubles of children and contained morphine sulfate, which did indeed soothe, with the thoroughness and reliability of opiates applied to infants. It was the era of Hamlin's Wizard Oil, which claimed to cure everything from rheumatism to cancer, and which contained alcohol, ammonia and camphor in a preparation that was at least bracing if not curative. It was the era of the travelling medicine show, the wagon with the canvas sides that came to town and drew a crowd with music and performance, and the confident testimonials of paid performers who described their miraculous recoveries from the very conditions the audience was sitting there hoping to address. The medicine shows were theatre, and the theatre was the product, and the bottles sold afterward were almost incidental, souvenirs of an experience that had made the audience feel for an hour that relief was available. Into this landscape came Richardson, who was doing something slightly different. He was not making dramatic claims. He was not promising to cure cancer or rheumatism. He was making a preparation for a specific and common condition, the chest cold with its cough and congestion, and he was using the combination of camphor and eucalyptus and petroleum jelly that he had worked out in his pharmacy, and he was selling it through drugstores rather than off the back of a wagon. This was a more modest enterprise, and in the long run a more durable one. The dramatic claimants of that era mostly did not survive the regulatory changes of the early 20th century. Richardson's more modest preparation survived because it was making a more defensible kind of claim, the claim of comfort rather than cure, of symptomatic relief rather than disease eradication. The camphor that Richardson used in his formula has a history in medicine that stretches back centuries. It is a waxy crystalline substance extracted from the wood of the camphor tree, Cinnamomum camphora, native to East Asia, and it had been part of both Chinese and Ayurvedic medical traditions for more than 1,000 years before it arrived in European and then American medicine. The smell of camphor is one of those smells with an almost universal association with medicine, an association that predates Vicks VapoRub by many centuries. Chinese physicians used it for respiratory conditions and for skin complaints. European physicians brought it into their practice in the medieval period and used it as a stimulant and a treatment for fainting and nervous conditions. By the 19th century, it was in dozens of preparations sold in American pharmacies, and its smell alone carried the credibility of a long medical lineage. Eucalyptus oil came from a different direction. The eucalyptus tree is native to Australia, and the oil distilled from its leaves was brought into Western medicine in the 19th century by German chemist Johann Ross Messler, though indigenous Australians had been using the leaves medicinally for far longer. By the mid-19th century, eucalyptus oil was being used in European hospitals as an antiseptic and a treatment for respiratory conditions, and by the time Richardson was experimenting with his formula in the 1880s, it was a recognised pharmaceutical ingredient available from suppliers. The eucalyptal compound that gives eucalyptus oil its characteristic smell has genuine pharmacological properties. It is a bronchodilator in high doses, an expectorant, and it has demonstrated antimicrobial activity in laboratory settings. These are not the placebo-only effects of a folkloric remedy. They are real mechanisms, which is one reason why eucalyptus oil appears in pharmaceutical preparations in the 21st century, and not only in the ones that are labelled natural or traditional. Menthol, the third major active ingredient in VapoRub, is derived from peppermint oil and has its own long history in medicine, used in Eastern and Western traditions alike for headaches, muscle pain, and respiratory symptoms. What menthol does in the nose and throat is activate cold-sensitive receptors called TRPM8, producing a cooling sensation that is entirely perceptual rather than physical, but that is experienced as real cooling, and that in the context of a congested nose creates the sensation of freer breathing without actually opening the physical passages any wider. This is a pharmacologically interesting thing. The sensation and the physical reality are different, but the sensation is real. The person who feels less congested is having a genuine experience, even if the airway has not changed dimension. What constitutes effective treatment for a symptom is a question that remains more complicated than it might initially seem, because symptoms are experienced, and the experience of fewer symptoms is itself a form of relief. Richardson built his formula from 3 ingredients with genuine physiological activity, and carried them in a base of petroleum jelly, which was invented by Robert Cheeseborough in 1872, and which was already, by the 1880s, a widely available pharmaceutical base used for its emollient properties and its ability to hold volatile compounds in suspension. The petroleum jelly base solved a practical problem that Richardson must have recognised immediately. The volatile oils of camphor and eucalyptus and menthol would evaporate rapidly from a liquid preparation, dissipating their smell and their activity before they could be used. In the petroleum jelly base, they are held in suspension, releasing slowly as body heat softens the base and allows the volatile compounds to reach the surface and evaporate into the air around the patient. The delivery system was, in its way, elegant. The sales growth of Richardson's company in the years between its founding and the 1918 pandemic was steady but unremarkable, the kind of regional growth that characterises a product with genuine utility and adequate distribution, but without the explosive event that creates national awareness. Richardson had built a small factory in Greensboro and had a network of salesmen covering the southeast and mid-Atlantic states. The product was on the shelves of the kind of drugstores that Hanover's represents, known to pharmacists and to the customers who had tried it and returned for it and told their neighbours. It was, by 1917, a product with a loyal regional following and the infrastructure to scale if the right circumstances appeared. The right circumstances appeared in the most terrible possible way. The influenza pandemic of 1918 arrived in America in a series of waves, the first in the spring of 1918, which was bad but not extraordinary by historical standards for respiratory illness. The second wave, which arrived in the fall, was different in ways that are still not fully understood. It killed young, healthy adults in proportions that no influenza had killed them before. The W-shaped mortality curve, which showed peaks in both the very young and the very old, as well as an unusual peak in adults aged 20 to 40, was unlike anything anyone had seen. Healthy people were dying within days of showing symptoms. Military camps, which had gathered hundreds of thousands of young men into close quarters, were devastated. Hospitals were overwhelmed, and medicine had nothing to offer. The nothing that medicine had to offer is worth being precise about. There were no antivirals. There were no antibiotics, not yet. Penicillin being still a decade away from Alexander Fleming's observation in 1928, and 2 decades away from Howard Florey's work that would make it clinically usable. The sulfur drugs, which would be the first antibiotics available, were not synthesized until the 1930s. What medicine had in 1918 was aspirin and supportive care, and the aspirin was being administered at doses that we now know were high enough to contribute to some of the deaths, the high-dose aspirin causing pulmonary edema in some patients whose symptoms were already affecting the lungs. In this environment, what a family could actually do for an influenza patient was essentially what the home remedy tradition had always done. Keep them warm, keep them hydrated, keep them as comfortable as possible, and apply, to the chest, the camphorated preparations that had been used for respiratory illness for generations. Not because anyone in 1918 had a clinical trial showing their efficacy against influenza specifically, but because they were what was available and they provided the sensation of doing something, which was itself therapeutic in the context of a pandemic in which helplessness was its own form of suffering. Richardson's company sold its 12 million jars into this atmosphere of need and fear and the desperate search for anything that could be placed in a family's hands. The jars went out through the distribution network the company had built over the previous decades, and they were bought by people who were not necessarily confident they would help, but were certain they had nothing to lose by trying, and who understood, in the specific way that caregivers understand, that applying something to the chest of someone sick is not nothing. It is the act of trying. It is the physical enactment of caring. And the physical enactment of caring has effects that are not separable from the rest of the treatment, not incidental to it, not less real because they resist quantification. After the pandemic, VapoRub's national presence was established. The 12 million jars had seeded the country with the product in a way that the regional salesman could not have accomplished in a decade of ordinary commerce. The smell of camphor and eucalyptus became the smell of chest illness treatment across the country, not just in the South and Mid-Atlantic where Richardson had built his original customer base. The following decades, the 1920s and 30s, and then the great post-war expansion of the 1940s and 50s, saw the product deepen its penetration into the American household until it reached something like ubiquity, the state in which a product is so thoroughly expected to be on the shelf that its absence, rather than its presence, is the thing that requires explanation. The advertising that supported this expansion is worth looking at as a document of the era's assumptions about health, family, and the domestic role of women. The VapoRub advertisements of the 1930s and 40s showed mothers. They showed kitchens and bedrooms and sick children, and the mothers who attended them, and they showed the product as the tool that enabled the mother to do the thing she was fundamentally there to do, which was to take care of the sick child and return him to health, and to school, and to the ordinary world of childhood. The mother in the advertisement was always calm. She was never overwhelmed. She was never up at 3 a.m. wondering if she was doing the right thing, never second-guessing the temperature reading, never making the calculation about whether this had gone on long enough that the doctor needed to be called. She simply applied the product, and the child recovered, and the sequence was presented as causal and complete. This was the fiction that advertising traded in, and it was a productive fiction in the commercial sense because it associated the product with the fantasy of competent, composed maternal care rather than with the reality of anxious, exhausted maternal care in the middle of a Tuesday night. But it also told women something about what they were supposed to be in these situations, something about the standard they were expected to meet, which was the standard of the advertisement, the calm and capable woman with the blue jar and the flannel square, and not the actual woman who was scared and tired and wasn't sure and wished there was someone to ask who knew more than she did. Lunsford Richardson did not design this advertising. By the time the advertisements were running in the major magazines, he was gone, dead in 1919 at the end of the pandemic year, and his son was running the company. But Richardson had created something that generated the advertising, something that existed in the space between medicine and not medicine, between the official and the domestic, and that space was where millions of American families lived their medical lives. The product worked well enough in that space. It worked in the sense of providing real symptomatic relief, real comfort, real warmth. It worked in the sense of being something you could do. And it worked in the sense of smelling like being taken care of, which is a form of working that is not measurable but is entirely real, and which is perhaps the most enduring contribution that Lunsford Richardson made to the world he left in 1919. The blue jar itself became a kind of cultural touchstone in the mid-20th century in ways that went beyond product recognition. Novelists mentioned it. Memoirists referenced it as a marker of a certain kind of childhood. The smell of VapoRub appears in memoirs from the 1940s and 50s and 60s as a shorthand for a specific emotional experience, the experience of being taken care of during illness, and the shorthand works because it is precise. The smell is unmistakable. It carries no ambiguity, no possibility of confusion with any other smell. You smell it and you know exactly what it is and exactly what it means. This precision is part of what makes it so effective as a memory trigger. Vague smells produce vague associations. Specific smells produce specific memories, and VapoRub is one of the most specific smells in the American domestic inventory. The children who grew up in households where VapoRub was used, and that included an enormous proportion of American households in the post-war decades, received it as a form of conditioned experience, the smell becoming inseparable from the complex of sensations that surrounded it. The weight of the blanket, the particular quality of sick day time, the sound of the house moving around you while you are still in bed at 10 in the morning, the warmth of the flannel square, the sensation of breathing more easily or feeling like you were breathing more easily, which was as good as the same thing in the moment. All of these things became part of a single memory cluster anchored by the smell, and the smell became the key that opened the whole cluster when it was encountered again. This is why people who no longer live in the households where VapoRub was used, who have moved away and grown up and built their own households with their own medicine cabinets, still sometimes buy a jar when they are sick, not because they have assessed the clinical evidence and concluded that camphor and eucalyptus in petroleum jelly is the optimal treatment for their current condition. Because the smell belongs to being taken care of, and when you're sick and not 7 years old and your mother is not downstairs making hot lemon and honey, the smell is what is available. The smell is the closest thing, and the closest thing is, in its way, enough. Richardson's formula outlasted him by more than a century and will very likely outlast us. It outlasted the patent medicine era that produced it, outlasted the regulatory changes that eliminated most of its contemporaries, outlasted the antibiotic revolution that fundamentally changed the relationship between American households and infectious illness, outlasted the social changes of the 1960s and 70s that transformed so many of the domestic rituals surrounding it. It outlasted because it did something real, because the doing of that real thing was also the doing of something emotionally real, and because the two things were wrapped so tightly together in the experience of receiving the remedy that they could not be separated without losing both. That smell, the camphor and eucalyptus of the blue jar, is on the shelf behind the pharmacy counter too. It is part of the landscape of remedies that a young woman in 1946 sorts and sells and advises about from 7:30 in the morning until 6 at night, 6 days a week, in a small town where she knows most of the people who come through the door and most of them know her. Let her step behind that counter now. You start at 7:30. The pharmacy opens at 8, but there are things to do before the door is unlocked, and Mr. Hanover is already behind the dispensing counter when you arrive, already in his white coat, already with his glasses on the end of his nose, which is the sign that something requires his full attention, and you should greet him. Take your coat off, tie on your own apron, and be ready before he finishes whatever he's finishing. This is how every morning begins. You have worked here for 3 years since you were 18 and needed work, and Mrs. Pelham at church mentioned that Hanover's on the corner needed someone for the front counter and the fountain, and you applied the next morning and were hired the same afternoon, and now you know where everything is and you know most of the customers, and you know when the aspirin supply is running low before it actually runs low. The store smells the way a drugstore in 1946 smells, which is a compound smell made up of many specific smells that have settled into the walls and the wooden floors and the glass cases over years and years. There is the clean, sharp smell of the dispensing area behind the counter, camphor and alcohol, and the chemical smell that is simply the smell of pharmaceutical compounds existing in proximity to each other. There is the sweet vanilla smell from the soda fountain, which carries from the back of the store all the way to the front windows, the smell of malt syrup and chocolate sauce, and the particular quality of the vanilla extract that goes into the egg creams. There is the smell of the toiletry display along the right wall, hand cream and face powder, and the gardenia scent of a lotion that has been popular since before you started working here. And underneath all of it, the wooden floor smell, the glass counter smell, the smell of a place that has been in the same location for 30 years and has absorbed 30 years of the town's daily life into its surfaces. You unlock the front door at 8 o'clock precisely. There is almost always someone on the sidewalk. This is a small enough town that you know who it will be before you turn the key, because the early customers are the same every day, the same people with the same needs, and familiarity is not just comfort here. It is efficiency, because knowing that Mr. Dowd takes a proprietary preparation for his arthritis and needs it filled every 3 weeks means you have already mentioned it to Mr. Hanover by 8:15, and the order is ready when he comes in at 9. The first hour is often for medicines. People who come early are often people for whom the errand is urgent, or people for whom the early hours are the only hours free from other obligations. Women with children who have a window between school drop-off and the beginning of the household's next demand. They come with a list, sometimes written, sometimes carried in their heads, and the list is organised by the shelf it corresponds to, because they have been coming in long enough to know the layout of the store the way they know the layout of their own kitchens. A woman comes in this morning with a child on each hip, which is not quite possible, and yet she is managing it. She wants aspirin, she says, and camphorated oil. And do you have the cod liver oil in the smaller bottle because the large one is too heavy to carry home on the bus? You do have the smaller bottle. You get it from the shelf and set it on the counter, and she looks at it with the expression of someone who has already done the math and knows the smaller bottle represents worse value per ounce, but also knows she is the person who has to carry everything, and that worse value per ounce is a price she is willing to pay today. You also have the aspirin and the camphorated oil, and while you're finding both of them, she has set one child down on the floor, where he immediately begins investigating the display of playing cards near the window, and she does not break from the conversation to retrieve him, which tells you she has assessed the playing cards as a safe environment for approximately 3 minutes. Cod liver oil is one of the great remedies of the 1940s, in the sense that it is genuinely effective for what it claims, and also in the sense that almost everyone who takes it regards the experience of taking it as one of the most unpleasant parts of the week. It is oil from the liver of the Atlantic cod, rich in vitamins A and D, and in the omega-3 fatty acids that mid-century medicine does not yet have the language to describe, but has empirically observed doing something useful in children who are given it versus children who are not. Vitamin D deficiency is a genuine public health concern in the northern United States in the 1940s, the winter months providing insufficient sunlight for adequate synthesis, and cod liver oil is one of the most reliable and affordable ways to address it. This makes it a medicine that pediatricians recommend and mothers administer, and children resist with a fervour that is entirely proportionate to the experience of swallowing a spoonful of fish oil. You have sold enough cod liver oil in your 3 years at the counter to understand the range of strategies parents use to administer it. Some add it to orange juice, which improves the experience marginally. Some use a chaser, a piece of bread or a cracker immediately after, to interrupt the aftertaste. Some simply give it straight and fast, the speed of delivery school of thought, which holds that prolonging the approach prolongs the suffering. The children who come in with their parents and stand at the counter while the cod liver oil is handed over look at the bottle with an expression that you recognise as the specific despair of something that cannot be avoided but is also not happening yet, which is its own particular kind of suffering. By mid-morning, the pattern of the day has established itself. The early urgency settles into a steadier rhythm. People come in for routine things, for the aspirin they forgot to buy last week, for the hydrogen peroxide they used up cleaning a cut, for the boric acid solution they use as an eye wash. They come in for the things they buy regularly, and also for the things they need advice about, and this is where your role becomes something different from simply locating products on shelves. Because advice is what a significant portion of the people who come through this door actually need, and the question of where advice ends and medical care begins is a question that the drugstore counter exists in the middle of permanently without a clear answer. A woman of perhaps 45 comes in with a look that says she has been deciding whether to come in for a day or two, and finally decided this morning. She does not want to go to Dr. Whitmore. She will tell you this before she tells you anything else, as if establishing this constraint first gives you the parameters you will need for what she's about to ask. She does not want to go to Dr. Whitmore because she does not think what she has is bad enough for Dr. Whitmore, or possibly because she does not want to spend the money, or possibly because she is afraid of what Dr. Whitmore might say, and all three of these things can be true simultaneously, and often are. She has a cough. She has had it for 2 weeks. It is not getting worse, she wants to emphasize that. It is not getting worse, it is just not going away. She wants to know if there is something she can take for it. You look at her. You're not a doctor. You have not been trained as a pharmacist. You're 21 years old and you are the woman behind the counter at Hanover's, and you have 3 years of watching Mr. Hanover handle exactly this situation, and you know something about how he handles it. You say, "Let me get Mr. Hanover." Mr. Hanover comes out from behind the dispensing counter, and he does not put on a white coat more visibly or clear his throat, or do anything that makes the consultation feel like a consultation. He simply talks to her. He asks about the cough, about whether it is productive, about whether she has a fever, about whether it is worse at night or in the morning, about whether she smokes, which she does, though she does not offer this immediately and only acknowledges it when he asks directly. He listens to what she says. He asks one more question about her age and whether she has had any similar coughs before, and then he tells her something. He tells her that a cough lasting more than 2 weeks that is productive deserves a doctor's attention, and that he can sell her something to make it more comfortable, but that he would be doing her a disservice if he let her leave, thinking a bottle of something from his shelf was sufficient for what she is describing. She does not want to hear this. You can see it in her face, the way it closes slightly, the way her eyes move to the shelf of remedies rather than staying on Mr. Hanover's face. She buys a bottle of an expectorant, which is the thing he can legitimately sell her, and she takes his card with the address of the clinic on it, which he gives her without making her ask, and she leaves. And you watch her go and you think about what just happened, which was not sales and was not medicine, but was something in between, something that required knowing the difference between what you could help with and what you could not, and being honest about that difference even when the customer came in hoping not to hear it. This is the moral geography of the pharmacy counter in 1946. You sell the things that can be sold, you advise within the narrow limits of what is appropriate. You call on Mr. Hanover when the situation is above those limits, and you develop, over time, the ability to read which situation is which requires a kind of attention and judgment that no one formally teaches you. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive, and that accumulates the way knowledge accumulates when you pay attention to everything that happens in front of you for 3 years. You know the difference between someone who needs an aspirin and someone who needs a doctor. You know the difference between a cold and something that is not a cold. You know this not because you studied it, but because you watched Mr. Hanover know it, and because you paid attention when he explained why. The soda fountain in the back of the store is yours from 11 until 2, when the lunch crowd comes and goes and comes again. This part of the day is different in its social texture from the front counter. The front counter is for need, the fountain is for pleasure, or for the version of pleasure that a 1946 small-town drugstore offers, which is considerable but contained. You make egg creams, which contain neither eggs nor cream, but are a combination of milk and chocolate syrup and seltzer water that produces a frothy, cold, deeply satisfying drink. The foam rising over the top of the glass, the chocolate settling at the bottom until you stir it up. You make malted milkshakes, the malted milk powder giving them a particular richness that regular milkshakes do not have, a slightly grainy quality that is entirely pleasurable and entirely specific to malted milk, rather than any other kind. You make cherry cokes from syrup, the soda water coming from the tap at the fountain, the maraschino cherry dropping in last, which is the detail that matters. You make grilled cheese sandwiches on a small grill behind the counter, and egg salad sandwiches that come from a bowl that was made this morning and will be gone by 1 o'clock. You make coffee, plain coffee in thick cups, which the older men order and hold with both hands and drink slowly, not because they are savouring it, but because they are extending the time spent sitting at the counter, which is not a place for eating and drinking only, but also a place for talking, for the specific kind of conversation that happens in a public place among people who know each other and have been knowing each other for a long time. There is a regular at the fountain, a man named Gerald Fry, who is probably 65, and who comes in every day at 12:15 and orders a grilled cheese and a coffee and sits at the counter and talks to whoever is there. He is not a nuisance. He is something the fountain needs, a fixture that gives the place a sense of itself, a person so reliably present that his absence would register as an event. He knows about your family. He knows that your father works at the mill and your mother sings in the church choir. He knows you went to see a particular film at the picture house last month because you told him when he asked, and he remembers. He's the kind of person who pays attention to the people around him and asks about them and remembers the answers, which is a kind of social skill that is not valued in the way it ought to be, and which makes the lives of everyone around him slightly better, in a way that is difficult to articulate but impossible to miss. The afternoon brings the school crowd, briefly, children with nickels who want candy or a small Coke, and then the quieter late afternoon when the day's work is done, and people stop in on their way home for the things they realise they needed during the day. A woman who calls her husband from the front of the store to add something to the order she's already making. A man who comes in for razor blades and lingers at the greeting card display, in a way that suggests he has remembered an occasion he was hoping not to have to remember. A teenager who wants something for a pimple, which she asks about in a whisper, as if naming the condition might confirm it, and you show her the sulphur soap on the shelf and tell her it helps, and don't mention that you used the same soap last winter, and it did help, because sometimes the thing that makes advice land is not that it is personal, but that it is delivered with the confidence of someone who knows. The remedies on the shelf behind you represent a specific moment in American pharmaceutical history. The war has ended and penicillin has been demonstrated to be real and effective, but it is not yet something that comes over the counter, not yet something that most people have access to in the way they will have access to it by the 1950s and 60s. The sulfur drugs, which preceded penicillin and which represented the first genuine chemical assault on bacterial infection, are available by prescription but not without one. What is available without a prescription is everything on your shelf: the aspirin and the camphorated oil, and the cod liver oil and the hydrogen peroxide and the boric acid and the iodine and the zinc oxide and the expectorants and the antacids, and the vitamin preparations, and the dozens of proprietary remedies that line the shelves, and whose claims range from reasonable to implausible to somewhere in the middle where most of the interesting territory lives. You develop opinions about the products. You notice which ones people come back to buy again, and which ones they buy once and never return for. You notice when a new product sells well immediately, and when it sits on the shelf for weeks before anyone picks it up. You notice the remedies that come in with a grandmother and leave with her granddaughter because the granddaughter saw it work. These are not the opinions of a scientist. They are the opinions of someone who has been watching people buy things for 3 years and paying attention to what happens afterward, and they are not without value even if they are not controlled and not rigorous, and could not be published anywhere. At closing time, which is 6 o'clock, there is the resetting of the store for tomorrow, the counting of the register, the wiping of the soda fountain surfaces with the particular cloth that smells of the cleaning solution you use on the fountain specifically, a smell that will associate itself permanently in your memory with the end of the working day and the sensation of your feet registering that they have been on them since 7:30 and are prepared to be done now. Mr. Hanover locks the dispensing cabinet. You pull the blinds. The store becomes the version of itself that exists between open and open, quiet and dim, waiting. What you know at the end of a day at this counter is the health of the town in a way that nobody else quite knows it. You know who is dealing with an ongoing condition, and who had an acute thing last week, and who has been buying something that suggests they are worried about something they have not named. You know this not because anyone told you, but because you were there, every day, at the place where the town came to manage its bodies, and you paid attention. That knowledge is not a clinical record and is not protected and is not anyone's official responsibility, but it is real, and it shapes how you see the people you see on the street outside and at church on Sunday and at the grocery store. It gives you a particular form of compassion, the kind that comes from knowing how much work it is to maintain a body through a life, and how much quiet effort goes into that work, and how much of that effort is managed not by doctors or pharmacists, but by the individuals themselves, in their kitchens and their bathrooms, with the products they buy on Tuesdays from a 21-year-old woman behind a counter who has learned, over 3 years, to understand what they are really asking for. The inventory behind your counter tells the story of the era's medical philosophy as clearly as any textbook, if you know how to read it. Arranged on the shelves in the systematic order that Mr. Hanover established when he opened the store 30 years ago, the products represent the accumulated judgment of a pharmacist who has been watching what people need and what helps them for 3 decades, and who has arranged the stock accordingly, not alphabetically or by manufacturer, but by the rhythm of demand, the things people need most urgently nearest to hand, the things they come in for occasionally toward the back, the things that are there for specific purposes that arise unpredictably, but that would be a serious absence if they were not there when needed, kept in a particular spot on the second shelf from the bottom, where the experienced customer knows to look. The aspirin is closest to the register. This is not a design choice, but an evolutionary one, the product having migrated toward the front over years of being the most reached for item, and eventually someone made it official by placing the stock there deliberately. Aspirin in 1946 is acetylsalicylic acid, synthesized by Bayer in 1897 and marketed under the trade name aspirin, though the trademark was seized by the United States government during the First World War along with other German-owned patents and trademarks, making it generic and available to any manufacturer. This means that the aspirin on the shelf is from several different manufacturers, and that Mr. Hanover's purchasing decisions are based on price and reliability of supply rather than brand loyalty, though he has opinions about the quality of the tablet itself, the way it dissolves, and how that affects absorption, opinions that he shares when asked but does not volunteer unprompted. Aspirin in the 1940s is used for a range of conditions that would look ambitious to a modern physician. It is used for headaches and arthritis and fever and menstrual pain and toothache and the general malaise of a body that is not feeling right in ways that do not yet have a specific name. The dose that was standard in 1946 is substantially higher than the dose that would be recommended today for most of these conditions. The anti-inflammatory properties of aspirin, which are genuine and significant, become more effective at higher doses, and the era of high-dose aspirin therapy for chronic conditions like rheumatoid arthritis was built on this observation. The side effects of high-dose aspirin, gastric irritation and bleeding risk, and the syndrome now called Ray's syndrome in children, were not fully characterized until much later, and the aspirin that left your counter went out with confidence on both sides of the transaction. Next to the aspirin, the bismuth subsalicylate preparations, which address stomach upset and diarrhea through mechanisms that are partly chemical and partly the same bismuth that has been used in various forms for gastrointestinal complaints since the 18th century. The product that will later be marketed as Pepto-Bismol exists in this era in earlier formulations, available in your store in a form that is essentially the same active compound in a slightly different presentation. It is pink. The pink is a choice. The pink has nothing to do with the mechanism and everything to do with the user experience of taking something for a stomach complaint. The specific reassurance of a colour that reads as gentle, as soothing, as suited to the internal landscape it is being asked to navigate. The expectorants are on the third shelf, above the cough suppressants, the distinction between the two being significant and not always understood by the customers who come in for something for their cough. An expectorant works to make secretions more fluid and easier to expel, which is the appropriate treatment for a productive cough. A cough that is bringing material up from the airways and needs to do so more efficiently. A cough suppressant works to reduce the cough reflex, which is the appropriate treatment for a dry, unproductive cough that is serving no useful purpose and is exhausting the patient. Using a cough suppressant for a productive cough is counterproductive in the most literal sense, suppressing the mechanism that is clearing the airway. This is information you have and that many of the people who come in asking for something for their cough do not have, and part of your job is to ask the right question, productive or dry, before reaching for either. There is a woman who comes in every 2 weeks for zinc ointment. Not a small tube, the largest size available, which she applies to her husband's hands in the evenings because he works in a trade that requires his hands to be in water for much of the day, and the water has taken a toll that the zinc ointment partially addresses, keeping the skin from cracking in the cold months and providing a barrier that allows the hands to heal incrementally rather than simply staying damaged indefinitely. She's been buying it for years, long enough that you have the size in stock specifically because of her, because Mr. Hanover noted the regularity of the purchase and adjusted the order accordingly. She knows this. She has never commented on it, but she knows it, and you can see in the way she reaches for the large size without checking to confirm it is there that she is expecting it to be there and would be surprised if it were not. This is the ecosystem of the drugstore, the dense web of regular needs and specific relationships and accumulated knowledge that makes it something different from a store and something closer to a social institution. You are part of this ecosystem in a way that took time to develop but that now feels organic, that feels like a property of the place rather than something you brought to it. You know which children are likely to come in on Saturday mornings because their parents have given them a nickel. You know which of the regular customers prefers to be helped immediately, and which one needs a moment to orient themselves before they are ready to engage. You know that Mrs. Kowalski does not want anyone to see that she is buying the feminine hygiene products, and will wait until the store is not busy, and will stand in a position that keeps the shelf she is reaching toward at least partially shielded from anyone who might glance from the door. The feminine hygiene products occupy a particular shelf, arranged with a discretion that is built into the shelving itself, not the most prominent location, not the least accessible, but a middle position that is findable without requiring navigation, and that does not make anyone feel they are announcing anything by approaching it. The products on this shelf include douching preparations, which are marketed with a language of hygiene and freshness that communicates, without saying it directly, that the natural state of the female body requires correction, a marketing philosophy that is not unique to this era, but that is particularly explicit in the advertising of this period. The products also include the sanitary napkins that have been available since the 1920s, when Johnson & Johnson began producing Kotex, and that by the 1940s are the standard product for menstrual management in the American household that can afford them. those who cannot having various homemade alternatives that no advertisement acknowledges. There are things that people ask you about at the counter that are not on any shelf, or rather they ask them in a way that is not quite asking, that is more like standing at the counter and not quite saying something while looking at the shelves. You have learned to recognize this kind of not quite asking. It usually involves a woman of a certain age, a woman who has children and who is calculating something, and who has come to the pharmacy because the pharmacy is where you come when you need something medical and you cannot go to the doctor, and who wants information that the pharmacy can and cannot provide in about equal measure. She might want to know about the products used for family planning. She might want to know what is available without a prescription for the prevention of pregnancy, which in 1946 is both a practical and a legal question, the Comstock laws having criminalised the distribution of contraceptive information through the mail and the legal status of contraceptive advice varying by state. She might have been using a rhythm method that has proved unreliable. She might have a husband who is not interested in the conversation. She might have several children already and a body that is telling her it cannot do this particular thing again. You are 21. You do not know what to say to this woman. Mr. Hanover handles it when she asks directly, with a gentleness and a discretion that is impressive and that you understand as a form of professional skill developed over 30 years of people asking him things that are difficult to ask. He tells her what is available, what requires a doctor's prescription, what the doctor can do, what the law currently says about these matters. He does not advise, he informs. He provides the information that allows her to make a decision that belongs to her and that he is not in the position to make for her, and he does it in a quiet voice, and he does not write anything down, and he does not remember it in a way that becomes part of the public knowledge of her situation. This is the unwritten professional ethics of the pharmacy counter, the code that is nowhere formalized but that is transmitted through the practice of watching someone like Mr. Hanover navigate these situations over years. The code is about information, providing it, protecting it, and understanding the difference between what is yours to say and what is not. It is about knowing that the people who come into this store are bringing their actual lives with them, and that the transaction that happens at the counter is never only a commercial transaction, never only the exchange of a product for money, but is always also a transaction of trust. The trust that what is said here will be handled with care, that the need behind the request will be recognized and treated with the respect it deserves. By late afternoon, the quality of the light through the front windows has shifted. The angle of it lower and warmer, the specific kind of late afternoon golden light that makes the glass cases and the chrome fixtures of the soda fountain look briefly beautiful, in a way that the cooler morning light does not achieve. The store in this light feels different, slightly drowsy, the rush of the midday done, the deliberate pace of the late afternoon taking over. You're wiping down the fountain surfaces again, a task that requires the kind of mechanical attention that lets your mind wander a little, and you're thinking about the day's encounters, the transactions and the conversations and the things that were not quite said. A boy comes in, perhaps 10 years old, with a look that says he's been told to come and has been rehearsing what to say on the way over. He wants something for a bee sting. His face has the particular tight expression of someone who is not going to cry and is working hard at it. You show him to the baking soda, which is on the shelf not as a pharmaceutical exactly, but as a practical staple that crosses the line between kitchen product and first aid, and you show him how to mix a paste with water and tell him to apply it to the sting and leave it on for a while. He nods with the seriousness of someone filing this information in a place where he can find it again. He buys the small box of baking soda and leaves, and you watch him go and think about the baking soda, which alkalizes the acidic bee venom and reduces the local inflammation, which is a genuinely effective treatment, which is the kind of thing that ended up in the folk remedy tradition because it actually worked and stayed there, because it continued to work and was cheap enough to be universally available and simple enough that a 10-year-old could be told how to use it on the sidewalk outside a drugstore. The remedies that live in this middle territory between kitchen and pharmacy are numerous and often effective. Baking soda for bee stings and stomach acid. Witch hazel, available on the shelf in its distinctive brown bottle, used as an astringent for minor skin irritations, and as a component of homemade cosmetics, and as a treatment for hemorrhoids, and as a general-purpose toner that bridges the gap between the medicine cabinet and the dressing table. Petroleum jelly, which Chesbro marketed as Vaseline, and which is used for everything from dry skin to chapped lips, to the prevention of diaper rash, to the protection of a wound after the bandage is applied. These are products that did not begin as medicines and did not arrive with medical endorsement, but that accumulated sufficient empirical support through domestic use that they eventually were studied and found to have the properties that had always been attributed to them. You close the register at 6 o'clock and you count the day's receipts, and the count is approximately what you expected it to be, because you have been doing this long enough that the rhythms of the week are predictable. Tuesday is not Friday, Friday is not Monday. You know which days bring the regular traffic and which days bring the unexpected ones, the people who have been putting something off and have finally come in on a Thursday afternoon because Thursday was the day that finally felt possible. You put the receipts in the drawer that Mr. Hanover will count again in the morning, because 2 counts are better than 1, and also because this is how it has always been done, and that is a sufficient reason for many things in a store that has been doing them this way for 30 years. You put on your coat. You say goodnight to Mr. Hanover, who is still behind the dispensing counter, still in his white coat, still with his glasses at the end of his nose. He says goodnight without looking up from whatever he is finishing, which is his way, and you have come to understand it not as indifference, but as the kind of focused attention that a man who has been doing his work carefully for 30 years brings to its last moments of the day. The same attention he brought to its first moments, the consistency of it being itself a form of respect for the work. You step out onto the sidewalk. The air is different from the air of the store, not medicinal, not vanilla and chocolate from the fountain, just the plain air of a mid-century American town at 6 in the evening, which has its own particular qualities and its own particular smells, and which feels, after 8 hours in the store, like something very close to freedom. The view from behind the counter is, in its way, the clearest view of all, because from behind the counter, you see the gap between what people expect from the remedies they're buying and what the remedies can actually deliver. You see it in the questions they ask and the questions they almost ask. You see it in the calculation every mother is running about when the kitchen shelf is enough and when it is not enough, and who to call when it is not. That gap between the official image of mid-century American domestic medicine and its lived reality is what we have been circling around all evening, and it is time to look at it directly. The magazines of the 1940s showed a very particular version of the American home. The kitchens were bright, the wives were rested, the children were healthy. There was a sense, built across thousands of full-colour pages of advertising and editorial content, that the American household was a managed, optimized system, that problems presented themselves cleanly and were resolved cleanly, that the only thing standing between your family and its full flourishing was the right product on the right shelf and the knowledge to use it correctly. This was, in most ways that mattered, a fiction. But it was a productive fiction, in the sense that people used it not as a description of their actual lives, but as a template for aspiration, a picture of what things might look like if everything worked out. Behind the bright kitchens and the rested wives and the healthy children, the actual American household was managing a medical situation that was considerably more complicated, more uncertain, and more improvisational than any magazine was prepared to describe. The home remedies that mothers used in the 1940s were not a quaint supplement to real medicine. They were, for many families, the first and sometimes the only medicine, the actual system by which the health of the household was maintained and disease was evaluated and decisions were made about when something required professional attention. Understanding this requires setting aside the nostalgic frame that tends to be placed around the subject and looking at it directly. The doctor in a small or medium-sized American town in the 1940s was a real person with real limitations. He had, typically, trained at a medical school that taught him what medicine knew in the 1920s and 30s, which was vastly more than a medicine had known before, but vastly less than medicine would know by the time of his retirement. He had office hours and he had house call capacity, though house calls were becoming less common as the car made it possible for patients to come to him rather than the reverse. He had a small inventory of pharmaceutical tools, the sulfur drugs, increasingly, and soon the antibiotics, but also a great deal that was supportive rather than curative, pain management and fever reduction and rest and hydration, and the honest acknowledgement that many conditions would resolve themselves if the patient survived them. He also had bills to pay. The 1940s in America was before comprehensive health insurance, before Medicare and Medicaid, before the systems that would later make a doctor visit a bureaucratic rather than a financial decision for most people. A visit to the doctor cost money. For many working class and lower middle class families, it cost money that was not comfortably available, or that was available but only at the cost of something else, and the something else mattered. So the decision to see the doctor was not automatic and was not simple. It was a calculation that involved the severity of the condition, the resources currently available, the time of month relative to the paycheck, and the memory of what had happened last time someone in the family had a similar thing, and whether the doctor had done anything that the family could not have done itself with the resources already in the kitchen cabinet. This is the context in which the home remedy system operated, not as ignorance or as quaintness or as a charming pre-modern tradition, but as a rational response to a set of real constraints operating on people who were doing their best with what they had. The women who administered these remedies were not naive. They were experienced. They had been sick themselves and had watched others be sick, and had observed what worked and what did not, and had built up a working model of the body's ordinary malfunctions and their ordinary solutions that was empirical in the most literal sense, based on observation, based on evidence, based on the fact that they had tried this before and it had worked before, or had not worked before, in which case they had tried something else. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. What they lacked was the framework that would allow them to understand why the things that worked, and why some of the things that also seemed to work were working for different reasons than the ones assumed. They did not know in 1943 that honey has genuine antimicrobial properties, that its high sugar content and low water activity make it a hostile environment for most bacteria, that it has been shown in controlled studies to be as effective as certain over-the-counter cough suppressants for reducing nighttime cough in children. They knew that it worked. They had been giving it for generations, and the generations had gotten better, which is not the same level of evidence as a clinical trial, but is not nothing either. They also did not know, in 1943, which of the remedies they were using were doing nothing at all, or doing nothing related to what they were believed to be doing. Castor oil administered for a chest cold is doing what castor oil always does, which is operate as a laxative, and it has no effect whatsoever on the chest cold. The confidence with which it was administered was confidence borrowed from a different indication, transferred to this one by an association between the general idea of purging and the general idea of removing illness from the body, an association that is internally logical and empirically unfounded. The people who administered it were not foolish. They were working with a model that was imprecise in its mechanism even when it was correct in its outcome, and the imprecision in mechanism led to occasional misapplication. Turpentine was used in some households as a remedy applied to the chest for lung conditions, or taken internally in small amounts mixed with sugar, a practice that was genuinely dangerous, and that persisted in some communities well into the 20th century, partly because of cultural transmission, and partly because of the particular confidence that comes from a treatment that is dramatic enough to feel medicinal. Turpentine taken internally is toxic. Applied to the skin in sufficient quantity, it can cause serious irritation and systemic absorption. The households that used it were not trying to harm their children. They were using a tool that had been handed down to them as effective, and had not been clearly contradicted by their own experience, partly because the conditions they were treating with it were largely self-limiting, and would have resolved regardless, and the resolution was attributed to the treatment. This is the central epistemological problem of the home remedy tradition. Most of the conditions that home remedies were applied to were conditions that resolved on their own. Colds resolve, minor fevers resolve, stomach upsets resolve, cuts and scrapes heal. The body is remarkably capable of managing its own ordinary malfunctions, and the vast majority of the remedies applied to those malfunctions were applied to conditions that were going to improve anyway, which meant that any remedy applied had a very high rate of apparent success, not because of its own properties, but because the body was already doing the work. Separating the genuine contributors from the coincidental passengers was a project that required controlled experimentation, and controlled experimentation was not something the kitchen could provide. What the kitchen could provide, and what it did provide, was care. Physical care, the doing of things, the preparation of things, the application of things, the attendance at a bedside, the taking of temperatures and the adjusting of blankets and the bringing of broth. These are not trivial. The research on what is now called supportive care, on the role of warmth and nutrition and hydration and rest, and the presence of the attentive person in recovery from illness, is substantial, and it consistently finds that these things matter. The patient who is warm and hydrated and nourished and attended to by someone who's paying close attention to how they are doing, is not the same as the patient who is warm and hydrated and nourished and attended to by no one. There is something in the attending that is therapeutic, and it is not the placebo effect exactly, though the placebo effect is real and should not be dismissed. It is something more than that, something that has to do with the social and emotional dimensions of illness, and the way those dimensions affect the physical process of recovery. The mothers who administered these remedies were providing this care as a matter of course, as a component of the remedy that was never identified as a component because it did not come in a bottle and did not have a name. The lemon and honey tea was not effective only because of its chemical constituents. It was effective because someone made it and brought it upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed while it was consumed. These two things were inseparable in the experience of the patient and are only separable in the retrospective analysis of the medical researcher, and it is worth noting that the retrospective analysis, however important and rigorous, is losing something real when it separates them. The home remedy tradition also carried within it a significant amount of knowledge that was specifically women's knowledge, transmitted between women, often not written down, existing in the form of remembered practice rather than recorded instruction. This knowledge was not considered knowledge in the formal sense by the institutions that decided what counted as knowledge. It was not taught in medical schools, it was not published in journals. It occupied the space that women's domestic expertise always occupied, acknowledged as useful in the domestic sphere and categorically excluded from the sphere in which expertise was formally recognized and rewarded. This had consequences. It meant that the remedies were not studied in the way that physician-administered treatments were studied. It meant that the genuine contributors were not identified, and the coincidental passengers were not weeded out. It meant that the whole tradition was handled by the emerging medical establishment of the early and mid-20th century with a mixture of condescension and strategic appropriation, the condescension taking the form of warnings about old wives' tales and the strategic appropriation taking the form of studying the most promising home remedies in clinical settings and publishing the results under names that did not acknowledge the origin. Chicken soup, which had been administered by mothers and grandmothers across cultures for centuries before anyone tested it formally, became the subject of a genuine peer-reviewed study in the 1980s that found it had measurable effects on the activity of neutrophils, the white blood cells involved in the inflammatory response. The study was reported as a novel finding. The patent medicine industry, which ran alongside the home remedy tradition, and frequently intersected with it, was its own kind of hidden reality. In the decades before the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 and the subsequent regulatory expansions of the 1930s and 40s, the patent medicine market was an extraordinary place where products could make essentially any claim, where the contents of a bottle did not have to be disclosed, and where a significant number of the most popular remedies contained alcohol, opiates, or cocaine in quantities that would result in the immediate removal of the product from the market today. Laudanum, which was opium dissolved in alcohol, was available without a prescription for much of the 19th century and was widely administered to fussy infants, to women with menstrual pain, to anyone with a cough. The sleep it produced was real. The relief it provided was real. The addiction it caused was also real, though it was not recognized as addiction in the contemporary sense, and was often simply interpreted as the patient having developed a dependency on the medicine, which was true but incomplete. By the 1940s, this era was largely over. The regulatory environment had tightened significantly. The Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act of 1938 had been passed in response to a disaster involving a sulfur drug formulation that killed more than 100 people, and it required for the first time that new drugs be demonstrated safe before they could be marketed. But the legacy of the patent medicine era persisted in the landscape of over-the-counter products available in the 1940s, in the confidence with which unverified claims were made, in the persistence of products whose mechanisms had never been rigorously examined, in the cultural belief that a bottle with a label and a price was medicine in a way that a jar of honey or a lemon from the string bag was not. The geography of who had access to which layer of this system was not neutral. In cities and in middle-class households, the doctor was more accessible, the pharmacy more stocked, the range of options wider. In rural areas, in poor communities, in the African American communities of the South operating under the dual constraints of segregation and poverty, the home remedy tradition carried more weight and lasted longer not because those communities were more ignorant, but because those communities had less access to the alternatives. The Tuskegee study, which was not exposed in its full horror until 1972, is the most extreme example of what happened when the medical establishment made specific decisions about which communities deserved full access to its best knowledge and tools. But short of that extreme, the ordinary inequalities of access shaped who relied on home remedies out of conviction and who relied on them out of necessity. The women who held this tradition were not passive. They were active, adaptive, and often astute. When the remedy that had always worked stopped working, they tried something else. When they encountered a condition that was outside the range of what the kitchen shelf could address, they recognized it usually, though not always, and they made the calculation about when to escalate. They were doing, with the tools available to them, something that looked a great deal like triage, the prioritization and sorting of medical needs by severity and treatability, a skill that is now formalized and credentialed, and that in the 1940s was performed by women in aprons who had never been near a medical school and would not have been admitted to one if they had tried. The legacy of this tradition in the American household is not extinct, it is adapted. The chicken broth is still there, though it may now come from a carton rather than a carcass. The honey and lemon are still there, and the research that now supports them would have surprised no one who had been giving them for 4 generations. The Vicks VapoRub is still there, in the same blue jar with the same smell, sitting on the same bathroom shelf in the same relationship to the same winter cough. What has changed is the surrounding context, the range of pharmaceutical options available without a prescription, the ability to look up a symptom in seconds, the presence of urgent care clinics in strip malls and telemedicine on phones, all of which have added layers to the system without eliminating the original layer. And there is something worth noticing in what persisted and what fell away. The remedies that had real physiological mechanisms survived. Warmth survives, hydration survives, rest survives, honey survives, steam survives. The remedies that were doing nothing except providing the comfort of action, most of those faded, replaced by products that did the same nothing more efficiently and at greater cost, but at least with a printed warning label and a listed set of inactive ingredients. And the practice of attendance survived, the being there, the hand on the forehead, the bringing of things to someone who cannot get them for themselves. That survived because it was never just a remedy. It was what a remedy looked like when it was delivered by someone who loved you. And no amount of clinical rigor has found a way to improve on that particular mechanism. The onion remedy deserves its own moment of examination, not because it is the most dramatic of the home remedies that circulated in the 1940s, but because it is one of the most revealing. The onion poultice, the practice of slicing onions and applying them to the chest or feet for respiratory illness, or placing halved onions in the room of a sick person to absorb disease from the air, was a remedy that existed in American domestic practice and that the medical establishment dismissed, consistently and confidently, as superstition. The dismissal was not entirely without merit. The theory of disease absorption, the idea that the onion could pull illness out of the air or through the skin, is not mechanistically sound in any way that connects to what medicine now understands about how infectious illness spreads. And yet onion, examined more carefully, is not without pharmaceutical properties. Quercetin, a flavonoid found in significant quantities in onions, has demonstrated anti-inflammatory and antioxidant activity in laboratory studies. Organosulfur compounds in onions have demonstrated some antimicrobial activity, and the volatile sulfur compounds that give onions their characteristic smell, the compounds that make you cry when you cut one, have demonstrated bronchodilatory effects in animal studies. None of this vindicates the specific practice of putting a halved onion in the room or applying an onion poultice to the feet as the mechanism by which those properties would be delivered in quantities sufficient to have clinical effect. But it complicates the simple dismissal of onion as purely folkloric, because the plant that was chosen by generations of domestic medicine practitioners for its respiratory-related properties turns out, on examination, to contain compounds that do actually have respiratory-related properties. This is the pattern that repeats across the home remedy tradition when you look at it carefully. The mechanism proposed is wrong. The compound responsible for the effect is not the one identified by folk knowledge. The delivery method is often inefficient, and yet the underlying botanical or household material has real properties that make it not unreasonable to use for the purpose it was used for, properties that could not have been known by the women who used it, but that selection pressure, the accumulation of observations across generations, managed to identify without knowing the mechanism. This is not magic. It is the emergent intelligence of an empirical practice operating over centuries, and it deserves more credit than the word superstition can provide. The garlic tradition is similar in structure to the onion tradition, and even more extensively documented across cultures. Garlic has been used medicinally in virtually every culture that had access to it, and the range of conditions it was applied to is enormous, from infectious illness to heart disease to digestive complaints to wounds. In the 1940s American household, garlic appeared in various forms as a home remedy, eaten raw for the prevention or treatment of colds, applied as a compress, or infused in oil for ear troubles. The mechanism that the folk tradition attributed to it was often vague, a general sense of garlic as powerfully medicinal, of its pungency as evidence of its potency. The mechanism that medical research eventually identified is allicin, a compound produced when garlic is crushed or chopped, with documented antibacterial activity against a range of pathogens including Staphylococcus aureus and some strains of E. coli. The antibacterial properties of garlic are real. The doses available from dietary garlic are modest. The application method matters. But the core premise that garlic is antimicrobially active is correct. The honey that appeared so centrally in the home remedy kitchen of the 1940s has been the subject of more clinical research than almost any other food-based remedy, and the research has been notably positive. The antimicrobial properties of honey were noted by ancient Egyptians and Greeks, and were used for wound treatment for thousands of years before the mechanism was understood. The mechanism, when finally characterized, is multiple. The high sugar content creates an osmotic environment hostile to bacteria. The low pH inhibits bacterial growth. The low water activity prevents bacterial reproduction. And in raw honey specifically, an enzyme called glucose oxidase produces hydrogen peroxide continuously, providing a slow-release antimicrobial environment. Manuka honey, from bees working the manuka plant in New Zealand, has been the subject of particularly extensive research and has been cleared by regulatory agencies in several countries for clinical use in wound care. The clinical research on honey for cough is equally interesting. A randomized controlled trial published in the Archives of Pediatric and Adolescent Medicine in 2007 compared honey, dextromethorphan, which is the cough suppressant in many over-the-counter preparations, and no treatment for nighttime cough in children aged 2 to 18 years. Honey outperformed both dextromethorphan and no treatment on all measured outcomes, including cough frequency, cough severity, bothersome nature of the cough, and the child's and parent's sleep quality. The trial was small, and the authors called for further research, but the finding was striking enough to receive significant attention. A 2012 Cochrane review found limited evidence supporting honey for acute upper respiratory tract infection in children, but noted the absence of serious adverse effects and the plausibility of the mechanism. The researchers who conducted these studies were not building on a tradition they knew about. They were investigating a hypothesis generated by observing that honey had antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory properties that might be relevant to cough. They were not acknowledging that American mothers had been giving honey for coughs for a century, and that the clinical trial was in some sense catching up to the kitchen. The grandmother who stirred honey into the hot lemon tea did not know about glucose oxidase or osmotic activity, or the Cochrane collaboration. She knew that her mother had given her honey when she had a cough, and that her mother had gotten better, and that she'd given her children honey when they had coughs and her children had gotten better. The transmission of knowledge was not through mechanism but through outcome, and the outcome was real. The relationship between the folk tradition and the formal medical tradition in the middle decades of the 20th century was not simple mutual ignorance. There were medical practitioners who took the folk tradition seriously, who were interested in the botanical remedies and the household preparations and who saw them as a source of hypotheses worth testing. There were also medical practitioners who saw the folk tradition as an obstacle to proper care, as the thing standing between patients and the treatments that actually worked, as a repository of superstition and misattribution that needed to be cleared away. Both perspectives existed simultaneously, and the second was probably more common in the formal medical literature of the 1940s, the era in which the prestige of scientific medicine was at its highest, and the contrast with the folk tradition was most explicitly drawn. The sulfur drugs had arrived in the 1930s and had demonstrated for the first time that bacterial infections could be treated by chemical means, that medicine could intervene in infectious illness in ways that were qualitatively different from the supportive care that had always been the main tool. The development of penicillin in the 1940s extended this demonstration dramatically, and the optimism of the era about what pharmaceutical medicine could and would achieve was genuine and not unreasonable given the evidence. In this context, the home remedy tradition looked, to many medical professionals, not just insufficient but actively harmful, because it might delay the patient from seeking the treatments that could actually cure rather than merely comfort. This concern was not without merit. A serious bacterial infection treated with lemon and honey, while the patient waited to see if things improved, was a patient who was getting worse while the sulfur drugs sat in the pharmacy not being used. But the concern was applied without discrimination between the remedies that were genuinely delaying necessary treatment and the remedies that were providing appropriate supportive care for conditions that did not require pharmaceutical treatment. The common cold, in 1946 as in any other year, did not require pharmaceutical treatment. It required supportive care, hydration, warmth, rest, symptomatic relief, and time. The home remedies were, for the common cold, an appropriate response. The problem was not that people were using them. The problem was that the system lacked the nuanced framework that would allow people to know which conditions required escalation and which did not, and the home remedy tradition, whatever its individual merits, did not provide that framework any more reliably than the medical system provided clear guidance about the costs and benefits of choosing not to escalate. The grandmother's role in the transmission of the home remedy tradition is worth examining separately, because the grandmother occupied a specific social position in the 1940s American household that gave her both authority over the tradition and a certain immunity from the kind of institutional pressure that might have modified it. She was old enough to have used the remedies before penicillin existed, old enough to have seen them work and to remember their working as the baseline for comparison with anything newer. She was old enough to remember the deaths from illnesses that the antibiotic era would later address, and this memory gave her a realistic rather than nostalgic relationship to the limits of the home remedy tradition. She knew it had limits. She had buried people who were past those limits. She used the remedies for the things the remedies were appropriate for, and she had a working sense of the line, built from decades of observation, that distinguished the things the kitchen could handle from the things the kitchen could not. Her authority in the household was often informal but was nonetheless real. When the grandmother came to visit and a grandchild was sick, the grandmother's opinion about the treatment was solicited, and if the grandmother's opinion differed from the mother's current approach, a negotiation occurred that was more often than not resolved in the grandmother's favour, not because the grandmother was objectively more likely to be right, but because she was older and had seen more, and her certainty was of a different texture from the mother's uncertainty. And certainty has a way of winning these negotiations regardless of its actual epistemic foundation. The class dimension of the home remedy tradition, the way it intersected with economic access and cultural background, is a thread that runs through the whole history and that is important to make explicit. The families for whom the home remedy was the first and often the only layer of medical care were disproportionately families for whom professional medical care was genuinely inaccessible, either because of cost, geography, cultural barriers, or the explicit exclusion of certain communities from the standard medical system. In the black communities of the American South, and in immigrant communities throughout the country, the home remedy tradition carried more weight not because of lesser sophistication, but because of fewer alternatives. The health disparities that resulted from unequal access to professional medical care in the mid-20th century are well documented in their outcomes, in the mortality statistics and the morbidity data that show differential rates of death and disease by race and class throughout the period. What is less often documented is the extraordinary ingenuity and genuine effectiveness of the home care systems that communities with limited access to professional care developed and maintained, systems that included the home remedy tradition and also extended beyond it into networks of community knowledge, informal health advisors, midwives and herbalists, and the kind of woman in every community who was the person you went to when you needed to know what to do before you could get to anyone official. Midwives in the 1940s practiced in a landscape that was actively hostile to them institutionally. The medicalization of childbirth, the movement of birth from the home to the hospital that accelerated dramatically in the 1930s and 40s was explicitly framed in terms of safety and scientific progress. The hospital birth was modern. The home birth attended by a midwife was backward, a relic of the past, a risk to be managed by education and eventually by law. The statistics were used to support this framing, selectively. Hospital births did have lower rates of certain complications that arose from lack of access to surgical intervention, but they also had higher rates of certain infections and interventions that home births did not. Differences that the triumphalist narrative of hospital as progress was not inclined to highlight. The midwives who were pushed out of practice during this period took with them knowledge that was not preserved anywhere, knowledge that lived in their hands and in the accumulated experience of attending births across decades, knowledge about what normal looked like and how wide normal's range was and when something was genuinely outside normal, and when it was the anxious interpretation of a hospital system that had created its own baseline, by intervening in things that did not need intervention. This knowledge was not written down because it was not the kind of knowledge that gets written down, and it was not transmitted because the transmission was interrupted, and the interruption was presented as progress. What survives of the home remedy tradition in the 21st century American household is both more and less than what existed in the 1940s. More, in the sense that the range of over-the-counter pharmaceutical products available has expanded enormously, that the remedies for common conditions are more numerous and more specifically targeted. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. That the consumer has access to information about their conditions and the available treatments that would have been unimaginable in 1943. Less, in the sense that much of the embodied knowledge has been lost, the transmission interrupted by the decades in which the home remedy tradition was most actively delegitimized, the grandmothers who knew which of the remedies were genuinely effective, having found that their knowledge was unwelcome, and their grandchildren having been taught to go to the pharmacy or the doctor rather than to the kitchen shelf, and having lost the thread that connected the kitchen shelf to the centuries of observation that made it more than superstition. What remains in the kitchen cabinet and on the bathroom shelf is a residue of that tradition, still with us, still reaching for the same things, still making the lemon and honey tea, still reaching for the blue jar of Vicks, still adding honey to the tea of a sick child and knowing, in a way that does not require a citation, that it helps. The knowledge that underlies these practices is now available in the clinical literature, confirmed and quantified and published in peer-reviewed journals, and it is curious and appropriate that the confirmation found what the kitchen had always known. The tradition was not wrong. It was operating in the dark with a genuinely uncertain lamp, unable to distinguish the effective from the coincidental, unable to know why what worked. But it knew that it worked, and the knowing, transmitted through kitchens for a century, was waiting for the science to catch up. And so we come to the end of tonight's journey, and I want to sit with it for a moment before we go. Because what we have been through, across 4 very different corners of the same world, is really one long exploration of a single question. What does it mean to take care of someone? What does it look like in practice when there is not a clinical system available, when the doctor is expensive or inaccessible, or simply cannot be reached by 7 in the morning when a child wakes up with a cough and a slight fever, and a mother who is already awake, already listening, already running the calculation? We woke up in a 1940s kitchen and felt what it was like to be on the receiving end of that care. The lemon and honey too hot at first, the Vicks with its extraordinary specific smell, the flannel laid over the chest with a deliberateness that communicated something beyond the physical warmth of fabric. We understood, from the inside, that the remedy was not only the active ingredients, the remedy was also the person who prepared it, and the sound of the preparation coming up from the kitchen, and the knowledge that the day had been reorganized around your recovery, that you were the center of something unhurried and attentive. We followed Lunsford Richardson from a small pharmacy in Selma, North Carolina, through the extraordinary accident of the 1918 influenza pandemic, and understood how a product could survive more than a century, not because it was miraculous, but because it was real and consistent, and because the smell of it became the smell of being taken care of in such a fundamental way that no generation has been willing to let it go. The 12 million jars sold in those pandemic years tell us something about how people respond to emergency. They reach for whatever is in reach, and then they remember what worked, or felt like it worked, and they reach for it again the next time. We stood behind the pharmacy counter at Hanover's and learned the particular ethics of a position that was not medicine, but was not medicine either. The careful calibration of when to advise and when to defer, when to sell and when to send someone down the street to Dr. Whitmore's office with his card in their hand. We counted the cod liver oil bottles and the aspirin tins, and we made the egg creams and the malted milkshakes, and we listened to Gerald Fry talk about his grandchildren, and we understood that the drugstore in a mid-century American town was not simply a place where products were exchanged for money, but a place where the town took care of itself in the small daily way that a town takes care of itself when it is small enough to know who needs what. And we looked at the hidden reality, the gap between the gleaming magazine kitchen and the actual kitchen, the one with the dark amber honey in the mason jar and the dry mustard in the back of the spice cabinet, and the woman in the apron who had learned everything she knew from her mother and was making decisions every day that were medical decisions in all but name. We saw the limitations of that tradition honestly, the remedies that worked and the ones that worked only coincidentally and the ones that were wrong, and we also saw what the tradition carried that no clinical trial has ever been able to fully account for: the attending, the presence, the hand on the forehead, the sound of preparation in the kitchen below. The people who lived inside these routines were not simpler than us. They were not less sophisticated than us. They were people doing the most difficult thing there is, managing the health and well-being of people they loved with the tools available to them in their particular moment in history, making the best decisions they could with the information they had, finding the real contributors among the coincidental passengers by the oldest method available: observation and pattern and trial and time. And somewhere, in a kitchen that smells of something warming on a gas stove, in the early morning when the house is quiet except for the sound of a child coughing down the hall, a woman is already awake. She's already calculating. She already knows, more or less, what to do. And the dark amber honey is on the shelf, and the lemons are in the string bag by the window, and the blue jar is on the medicine shelf where it has always been. She does not need a clinical trial to tell her what she's about to do. She needs a pot on the stove and a mug and half a lemon and the same quiet confidence that came from the woman who taught her, and the woman who taught that woman, passed forward through kitchens across decades, arriving here, in this particular morning, in these particular hands. Thank you for spending tonight here with me. Sleep well. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.